Welcome back to Going Deeper. Today we're continuing through our study in the book of Jude entitled Contending for the Faith. Last time we were finishing up with verses 1 through 4, and today we're going to be moving on to verses 5 through 7. Now just to recap, in verses 1 through 4, we took a look at the enemies of the truth last time. These enemies of the truth who deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. They are pushing back against His rightful authority in their life and His rightful authority over the church. Now we're told in verse 4 that these people's punishment, their judgment was designated long ago. Now, that's a troublesome phrase when it says long ago they were designated for this condemnation. Now, that means one of two things. It means either their choices were predetermined long ago, as if they are merely puppets on a string, or it could mean that the punishment for their free will made choices was predetermined long ago. Now, it seems pretty clear when we keep things in context, as we always should, that looking at verses 5 through 7, where we begin to see these Old Testament examples and the punishment that was delivered to them for making similar choices, it seems pretty clear that what Jude intends in verse 4 is that the punishment for these rebels, for these false teachers, these who deny the authority of Jesus, their punishment for their free will choices was determined long ago. Certainly seems much more likely. Now, verses 5 through 7, we're going to encounter three different Old Testament examples of people who rejected authority, like the false teachers in Jude's day are doing, and those that exhibited disbelief or unbelief. And those choices to reject authority and to exhibit unbelief led to judgment for them a long time ago. And Jude's going to make the case for you and I that God hasn't changed, and therefore the way He deals with the rejection of His authority and unbelief is still going to be the same today, at least in the first century, and by extension the 21st century, as it was in the Old Testament. Now we're going to examine these Old Testament examples, and they are used here as illustrations. And they will help us arrive at a new summary sentence that we're going to be developing over the next few segments. Now, I want you to notice this first example that he uses in verse 5. So let's take a look at that together. He says, "Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe." He says, I want to remind you because they used to know this. So Jude is drawing their attention back to something that he explicitly says they once fully knew. Now he mentions here that Jesus saved a people out of the land of Egypt, and afterward those who did not believe were destroyed. Now, who are these people that he's talking about? Well, this seems to take us back to the book of Numbers 13 and 14, in those chapters to be exact. This is where it's described for us how those that came out of the Exodus in Egypt and camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they sent in the 12 spies into the promised land at Kadesh Barnea. The 10 of those spies that come back, they give a bad report of the land. They say there's giants over there. There's no way we can defeat them. And Joshua and Caleb are 2 of the 12 spies, the only 2 that come back and give a good report and basically say that if God is with us, who can stand against us? Well, the bad report of the 10 spies ends up where the people riot and they end up refusing to enter the promised land. That entire generation, we're told, was to have their carcasses scattered in the wilderness. They were doomed to die because of their rebellion. Now, depending on the translation that you may be reading, it may seem a little different from what the translation I read of verse 5 was, and some of those differences can be very interesting. So in order to understand that, let's take a trip to our old friend Blue Letter Bible, and that website, that app is going to give us some great functionality there to help us compare translations all at once. So let's take a look at that. So if we go to Blue Letter Bible and we just type in the verse that we're interested in, Jude 5, And we'll search for that. It's going to bring all this up. Notice that we can click on the Tools button that's just to the left of that verse. Now, today we're going to be using the Bible tab, not the interlinear tab that we're used to using. Notice that when we hit the Bible tab, we get a list of translations for Jude 1:5. And you can notice that all of these are set side by side with one another, and we can compare the differences that we see. Now, you can immediately see that if you're looking at New King James, for example, it says that, "I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who believed." Now, that's a little bit different from ESV, where it says that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed them. So why the difference in the way things are written here? Well, first of all, let me just make it clear that theologically it doesn't make a difference. We understand as New Testament believers that the Bible clearly teaches that Jesus is God. But just for curiosity's sake, let's just remind ourselves that all of our English translations are just that. They are translations. They have translated the Bible from the Old Testament original language of Hebrew, with some Aramaic thrown in, and also the New Testament is translated out of the Greek language, also with some Aramaic thrown in. Now, what we don't have is we don't have any of the original autographs or the original document that Paul penned down, or even as we're looking at Jude, we don't have the first generation copy of Jude's letter to the believers that were everywhere. So what we have here in front of us is an English translation of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and on we go infinitum. So there are thousands, literally thousands of manuscripts and portions of manuscripts of all the books of the Bible that are in museums and that have been discovered, and we've discovered many more through different archaeological digs along through the years. Now, these manuscripts, some of them, through carbon-14 dating, we've discovered that they are 1,000 years apart. So it's an amazing thing to realize that when you put all of those manuscripts and fragments and partial manuscripts together, that they are over 99% identical. What an amazing thing just to realize that the things that were written down by hand as copies of copies of copies could be identical, 99% identical, when they are 1,000 years apart. Who knows how many generations of copies have transpired in between? But it does mean 99% is not 100. I get that. So that means that there are some variants. But none of the variants lead to any type of contradiction in the Scripture. And none of the variances, like we have here, whether it's Lord or whether it's Jesus, none of them change the gospel. Most of the time where this comes from is that your more modern translations, like the English Standard Version of the New American Standard Bible, New International Version, those are going to be relying on older manuscripts. Now, older manuscripts are typically viewed as being closer to the original, and they didn't have as many variances in it. New King James, as well as King James, they're going to be relying on newer manuscripts that may have a few more variants in it than the older ones. But all that to say this, there's really nothing strange here to understand that this verse is talking about Jesus. Jesus in the Old Testament, we see in many other places, is called the angel of the Lord. He is the embodiment of the triune God. So the main point here is that those who did not believe in God, in the flesh, were destroyed. That's the way that God, Jesus in the flesh, behaved back then. That's the way that Jesus behaves in the first century. And because we know that Jesus doesn't change, He still behaves that way in the 21st century. So false teachers, rebels who reject the authority of God, who push back against truth, who exhibit disbelief in the Old Testament were judged. The same thing was going to happen to the false teachers in the first century as well as in the 21st century. But Jude doesn't stop there. He offers another Old Testament example as if to add evidence to his case. He mentions in verse 6, these people and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, left their proper dwelling, and he is kept in eternal change under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. I'll admit to you that verse 6 is a bit more difficult to understand than verse 5. But let's not miss the forest here for the trees. The point, just like these ancient examples that we've looked at already, just like the Exodus unbelievers and now these rebellious fallen angels, just like those, so these present false teachers that Jude was writing about were going to be judged. Verse 6 does say that the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority. Now, who in the world is that? Well, according to Jewish tradition, the sons of God that are mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, referred to fallen angels. Apparently, these fallen angels somehow took possession of human male bodies and mated with the daughters of men. Now, that is one understanding of how those scriptures should be interpreted. But scholars still debate whether or not that's the correct interpretation. I personally tend to think that it is, but this is not one of those things that's included in the faith that Jude was talking about in verse 3. This is one of those things that Bible-believing Christians are going to disagree on, and it's perfectly okay. We each have our opinion. So long as we're concluding that what the Bible teaches ultimately, that timeless universal principle is applicable to everybody, then we're okay. We don't have a problem. There is another popular interpretation of Jude 6 that I want to share with you, and that is that these angels who left their own position of authority really means that they chose to rebel with Satan in the original rebellion in heaven. And they left their proper dwelling, they left their proper station, their rank. Now, that works, but I don't think it works quite as well as the first one that I offered to you, because it says that these angels have been kept in eternal chains. That's problematic because even in the first century, there were obviously demons that were free to roam about and take possession of people and cause people all kinds of problems. They're not all of the demons, obviously, but it seems to be that what Jude's really talking about here is a subset of those original fallen angels. So just some curiosity things to look up perhaps for further study. But either way, the point here is that the violation of boundaries was a rejection of God's authority. They left their proper God-ordained dwelling. And the price for their rebellion and their disbelief and their disobedience was that they're going to be kept in chains until the judgment. The point is, they rejected authority, they disbelieved, they disobeyed, and therefore they were judged. And if God judges rebels in Numbers 13 and 14 with those Exodus unbelievers, if God even judges the angels who reject His authority, then how much more will these false teachers in Jude, and perhaps even in our day, how much more will they stand in judgment? Let's move on to verse 7, shall we? Verse 7 mentions a third Old Testament example. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality, are pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Don't miss that connecting prepositional phrase there, just as Sodom and Gomorrah. He's continuing with the same theme, adding evidence to evidence. Just as they, so will be these false teachers in His own day. Now you notice that it says, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality. Now, it's not exactly the same sexual sin as the fallen angels that were mentioned in verse 6, but it does seem to be very clearly articulated in Genesis 19 when we have the fuller story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that what's going on there is sexual immorality in the form of homosexuality. But both violated God's design and therefore fall under this wide umbrella that the Bible uses called sexual immorality. Again, the point, and that's the thing. The main thing is the plain thing. The point here is that all of these three Old Testament examples serve as an example for us today. That just the way that God did it in the past, because His character has not changed, He will continue to judge unbelief and rebellion in the first century to Jude's audience and that continues even today. So there's the three examples that Jude mentions. And again, his purpose is just to show that God's consistent with how He deals with rebellion. But He's going somewhere with this, as we're going to see in our next segment. So join me next time as we discover what these examples have to say to us and have to say to our audience today, just the same way that it did to Jude's audience back in the first century. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.